Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. This is John Ernie. I'm from Hong Kong Baptist University, and I'm very pleased to present second year in a row at this wonderful conference. Now, of course, I wish very much that I could physically be in Bangkok to do this. But anyway, in this recording, I'm trying to think through a new project of mine, the relationship between peace education for citizens and the role of human rights museums. Now, although human rights museums around the world continue to focus on the mission to educate or advocate for the mainstreaming of rights and to memorialize past events of trauma, not much attention has been paid to how these museums engender what I call a legal common sense. What legal norms or mandates do human rights museums in a particular country attempt to meet in order to shift nations and groups towards a justice-oriented and truth-telling understanding of past violence? Increasingly, I see this paper as arguing that human rights museums are actually sites of law. They are dynamic socio-legal institutions in the quest for social influence. Maybe I can share my PowerPoint at this point. So the title of my presentation is Peace as Legal Common Sense, the Case of Cultural Governance through Human Rights Museums. I hope these concepts would be made more clearly as I go on speaking. Basically, I am going to outline a new project that I plan to undertake next year when the possibility of traveling for fieldwork can be resumed, fingers crossed. In other words, the project is very much at kind of incubation stage. Okay. This is a project that attempts to critically engage with human rights museums as sites of cultural governance. It's the combination of a sense of governance through public education, public programming, outreach, that sort of thing, but done so in using a very cultural model of doing so. But I want to add into this kind of formulation of human rights museums a sense of its legal obligations, right? A sense that it is not only doing peace education as such, but doing so by complying with or proffering or even initiating new legal discussions about human rights and peace and conflict and reconciliation, really. Now, so I very much conceptualize human rights museums as a type of public cultural institution that engages in collecting and curatorial exhibition of artifacts with a threefold mission, right? To educate or advocate for the mainstreaming of rights, to memorialize past traumas, and as I said, the third function I very much believe should be the role of these museums is to engender a legal common sense among citizens. So if you ask this sort of question, what do you look at in terms of the work of these museums? You may want to think about how these museums articulate and execute the visions, what socio-political factors and as well as legal norms and mandates influence their work. And of course, what cutting-edge museological techniques would they adopt, right? Would they employ to realize these goals? Now, these questions animate this ambitious cultural survey of key human rights museums in 6 countries across the Trans-Pacific region. I'll talk more about why I focus on the Trans-Pacific region in this project. Now, my idea is hopefully to contribute to a reframing of museum studies, really, by mobilizing a hybrid method of analysis involving critical legal studies on the one hand and cultural studies on the other. Now, indeed, problems like immigration, refugee problems, racism, gender violence, climate change, etc., are pressing contemporary problems that are changing the foundational roles of museums. As Jennifer Carter and Jennifer Orange emphasized in the 2012 essay, they say the work of museums is changing radically. As the global rise of museums and museum networks dedicated to the subject of human rights over the past few decades has confirmed, museums can be beneficial to the dialogue and ongoing negotiation of human rights between civil society and government institutions. So the work of human rights museums as a special type of cultural institutions would need to develop their ethical sensibilities carefully. Yet, long time ago, Tony Bennett has reminded us in his important book, The Birth of Museums, this was in 1995, that the public museum should be understood not just as a place of instruction, but as a reformatory of conduct in which a wide range of regulated social routines and performances take place. So drawing on a Foucauldian perspective, Tony Bennett places the modern museum at the center of modern relations between culture and government. In this way, if human rights museums exist to educate and memorialize past atrocities, how will they negotiate with the political conduct of the government and with how that government wants to manage public memories? Human rights museums therefore matter. They very much matter, precisely because they are established with one foot on the people's side, as it were, and the other on the government's. Some scholars have coined the term museums of negative memory or museums of conscience to call attention to historical trauma that these museums focus on. Amy Sodaro, in her 2018 book called Exhibiting Atrocities, places memorial museums as part of the ever-growing trend of what she called dark tourism, reflecting a significant shift in the late 20th century in how societies, nations, and groups memorialize past violence. All over the world today, from Australia, Taiwan, Cambodia, Chile, South Africa to Israel, memorial museums reveal the truth about the past and seek to harness the perceived power of memory to heal communities and promote peace and reconciliation. The impulse of never again, right, that we've heard for quite some time now, never again, that impulse has now built international networks of museums through an increasingly transnational flow of memorial museum aesthetics and design, professional skills of museum management, urban policy development, etc., that reflects the global transcultural nature of this kind of museums. So museums begin to compare with each other because there are some similarities, right, of this type of human rights violations, of various types of human rights violations in different countries, and how the museums in those countries want to deal with their past. For example, the Federation of International Human Rights Museums, right, that organization was established in 2010. And that organization clearly attests to this kind of impulse. Through the work of this federation, we come to recognize human rights museums as networked institutions that by joining hands, they share human-focused stories more powerfully and mobilize transnational sentiments for cultural justice more effectively. Now, again, my project takes a bit of a special angle. Human rights museums, as I said, are cultural institutions, but in another way, the way I see it. I think they're sometimes created in accordance with human rights legal norms and mandates. A clear example is the prevalence of museums that link the Holocaust to human rights and genocide awareness as a response to various legally derived motivations, including, for instance, the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights report on Holocaust and Human Rights Education. There is the Committee on Conscience of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. There is the Task Force for International Cooperation on Holocaust Education, Remembrance, and Research, etc., etc. In all these cases, attempts were made to build museums so as to strengthen a broad, common legal consciousness surrounding genocide in general and the Holocaust in particular. This aspect of my project is in part inspired by the work of Jennifer Orange in her essay, Translating Law into Practice, Museums and the Human Rights Community to Practice. Orange points out that although states as well as transnational legal bodies have agreed to an impressive array of international human rights law in the form of treaties and declarations for over 70 years now, the way that these laws impact local communities, right, is inconsistent. Increasingly, right, Orange continues to point this out, right, that legal norms and mandates are linked to human rights museums in a direct way. Right? The former, that is the legal norms, have initiated the latter, that is the museums, in order to search for new ways to change values, norms, and practices of human rights in everyday lives. Jennifer Orange uses the community of practice framework, to demonstrate how museums are forming communities to support practices that aim to improve the human rights legal common sense around questions of marginality and violence. Similarly, one of the aims of my project is to examine how human rights museums develop local and even transnational communities to support learning difficulties, to support learning difficult knowledge of new norms. So I define the phrase legal common sense in this way. You know, I think that what we mean by that is that it is something that can evoke mutually recognized standards of behavior in a community, and is something that is established, strengthened, and disseminated among communities so as to help them learn and reinforce legal norms, both locally and globally. Indeed, because courts and tribunals have recognized the social value of museums, right? And they have increasingly mandated the establishment of museums as part of the remedial package in settlement agreements concerning mass human rights violations. Take a couple of examples. The Museum of Memory and Human Rights in Santiago, Chile, you're looking at the picture here, was built in part as a result of a recommendation made by a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The National Commission on Political Imprisonment and Torture, known as the VALEC Commission, was established to document the crimes that occurred under the Pinochet regime from 1973 to 1990. The VALEC Commission recommended reparations to individuals and families, as well as collective symbolic measures. The Museum of Memory and Human Rights was supposed to be one of these symbolic measures as mandated by the Commission. Another example, the District 6 Museum in South Africa is another example of how museums can support the practice of initiating legal claims. The Land Restitution Act under South Africa's new constitution became the legal mechanism through which people could return to the homes from which they had been removed. Researchers show us that the museum provided space for community gatherings as an institutional partner for the District 6 Beneficiary Trust and the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform, which orchestrated the legal process of land restitution and the Land Claims Commission. I believe that human rights museums can approach the question of the relation between these museums and the popularizing of legal common sense through raising the following questions. First, how have museums helped to realize the legal goals and recommendations issued by courts? Secondly, how have they used their archival expertise to support the evidentiary work of legal investigations of rights abuse? For example, those performed by Truth and Reconciliation Commissions or domestic and international criminal tribunals. Thirdly, have they been created as memorial sites themselves, where legal tribunals did their work by becoming a place-based visual and documentary archive of the tribunal's work, even after the latter's work, or legal work, had been completed? For example, the Sierra Leone Peace Museum is an example of a museum that stands after the tribunal closed. It was a project of the government of Sierra Leone and the Special Court for Sierra Leone, which was established to adjudicate crimes against civilians that occurred during the decade-long civil war. I realize my time is running short, but I do want to kind of summarize my thoughts here a little bit, because I ultimately want to argue in this project that I see human rights museums, right, this very special type of institution, as actually sites of law, which enact the very signifying forms that constitute socially salient distinctions about values, harmful acts, and justice. And these museums will help to adjudicate their meanings and even provoke new practices through which the meanings of rights can be debated and even disrupted. Rather than being static institutions, human rights museums are dynamic, legal institutions, I believe, in the quest for social influence. So I will speak in the next few minutes very briefly about a particular regional focus. I think that's the conceptual kind of framework of my study, but I want to move into talking about human rights museums that are found in the Trans-Pacific region. Now, some of you may remember this. There were in the discussion for global trade or geopolitics, the importance of a critical understanding of transnational rights is often sidestepped. So we're talking about the changing meanings and values that shape groups and peoples in mobility. Right? But around 2016 and 17, you may remember the discord over international trade surrounding the now defunct TransPacific Partnership makes explicit the necessity and timeliness for a gateway region to play an impactful role in shaping the region's understanding of human rights struggles. So this was very much in the Barack Obama kind of era, right? Now it's now defunct because he's been out of office for 4 years now. And at that time, the discussion among the Trans-Pacific countries, right? Countries that are around the Trans-Pacific in North America, South America, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, for example, they were not only talking about trade, because to have trade and economic health in the region, one also needs to discuss provisions for human rights protections, because we're talking about goods, people in mobility. What if there are military conflicts or even migration kind of issues or problems, refugee problems, for example? So the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership concept, the program, very much included a sense of human rights. Now, in this region, I just, maybe to make it more specific, I want to talk maybe about, now, so these are the countries very much involved in that discussion at the time. And I want to highlight Canada as an example of an important country in the Trans-Pacific region, right? So there, back in 2012, the report from the Citizenship and Immigration Canada project stated that by 2031, 59% of the population of the gateway city of Vancouver will be visible minorities who are predominantly Chinese, South Asians, Filipinos, Koreans, and West Asians. Vancouver School Board successfully implemented a leading edge sexual orientation and gender identity inclusion policy, which is now being widely adopted in other municipalities in the province. The successful mainstreaming of social inclusion in Vancouver should not be taken for granted, considering that Actually, Canada had a long history of exclusionary practices, especially in the province of British Columbia. You know, you think about the imposition of a head tax on Chinese migrants, leading to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1923. There was dispossession and internment of Japanese Canadians during World War II. There were banning of books depicting same-sex intimacy by a municipal school board in 1997. So what's currently going on in the city of Vancouver or in British Columbia should not be taken for granted. So they have had a remarkable kind of change from a history of discrimination to becoming a so-called model inclusive city, right? And that you know, is very important. Other important nations and their key cities along the Trans-Pacific corridor have similar histories of transformation of the citizens' human rights consciousness due to impact brought about by various kinds of cultural initiatives, including museums and archives and, of course, libraries. You think about cities like Melbourne and Perth in Australia, Wellington in New Zealand, Guangzhou and Seoul in South Korea, New Taipei City in Taiwan, Santiago in Chile, Bogota in Colombia, Los Angeles and San Francisco in West Coast United States, so on and so forth. These represent important cities that have significant presence of human rights museums, large and small in different scale, right? So just to, you know, say, just to maybe move forward a bit in this, I think the idea for focusing on the region is to maybe trying to kind of theorize a particular way in which we can talk about trans-Pacific cosmopolitan citizenship through the study of these museums, right? Maybe the museums provide a window, right, or various windows, if you will, for us to try to maybe map different ways in which we can compare the kind of legal common sense that I spoke about earlier, that were developed by these museums in the region. So this project is very much inspired by existing kind of a new kind of initiative in trans-Pacific studies, trans-Pacific cultural studies, which I won't get into very much here. Now, this is the list of 6 museums that I've chosen for my project. They include 6 different countries along the Trans-Pacific corridor. These are kind of you know, national level museums. Of course, they vary in scale and history, really. So I've chosen Australia, Taiwan, South Korea, Chile, Los Angeles, and Canada as the 6 countries in which I will do field work. So let me just close by saying a couple of words about what I'll do when I visit these museums. So I will, you know, conduct a close reading of their exhibitions with a focus on their presentation of the past through narratives, exhibition design, artifacts, photographs, documentary footage, testimony, audiovisual materials, interactive activities, and other exhibition strategies. So, you know, I will also examine the exhibition guides, right? You know, needless to say, I need to spend extensive time in each exhibit, in each museum. But the bulk of this project will require on-site fieldwork in the 6 case studies. The research activities will contribute to tracing the evolution of each case and the divergent political and cultural context in which these human rights museums were created. So the central method very much is, as you can imagine, it will require me to do institutional ethnography. Institutional ethnography. So by that, I mean an examination of the social, cultural, political, and legal context in which each museum was conceived, with a focus on the debates and controversies and intentions behind each museum's creation. For this, I will have to rely on archival sources provided by the museums, secondary sources, of course, but also importantly, interviews with museum directors and key staff involved in each museum. Now, in those in-depth interviews, I will try to talk or ask questions about what motivated you to create the museum, right? How did you determine the interactions among primary stakeholders, the creators, and the intended audiences, right? So what are the experiences that the museum want to provide for the visitor? How do they work to come to terms with the past, what challenges they face, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, very much, idea is to look at these case studies as networked museums framed by the kind of human rights debate and discussions around the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership framework. And through that, to begin to think about how memories of peace, memories of conflict, of violence, and ultimately peace and reconciliation, that sort of thing. We can think about these memories as interlinked, because what happened in many of the port cities that I look at very much involve people who are mobile, people who needed to leave their country because of human rights violations and fears and that sort of thing. So I think I'll stop here, and I hope to conduct this project throughout next year, 2021, really, to do 6 studies in 1 year. Hopefully the travel restrictions will be lifted, who knows. But I hope these ideas are useful for this conference. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing here.